on horrendous crimes committed by non-citizens who've successfully had visas granted to them on appeal, the Prime Minister's called time, not on his beleaguered Minister Andrew Giles, but on the special directive the Minister issued more than a year ago, which has allowed the Administrative Appeals Tribunal to return visas to dozens of criminals. In an attempt to relieve the pressure, Anthony Albanese has announced Andrew Giles will have to write an all-new order, one that puts the protection of Australians first, above all other matters the AAT considers when deciding whether a non-citizen should get a visa or be deported. It's an about-face, especially on the deal done with the New Zealand government, which had for so long wanted a softer line on deportations of Kiwi criminals and finally got it with Prime Minister Albanese. So this is the breaking news and we'll look at it today. Live from Canberra, recognising traditional custodians around here, I'm Jennet. You're watching Afternoon Briefing. Events have moved very quickly around Andrew Giles and the deeply troubled administration of immigration this afternoon. He is, it's fair to say, the man of the moment in national affairs and in this Parliament building. So we'll soon be joined live by the Immigration Minister, fresh from his announcement in the House of Representatives that he'll be rewriting his ministerial direction on the treatment of visa applications by the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. As you'll be aware, no doubt, media interviews by Mr Giles haven't exactly been common of late, so we will have the opportunity to ask him a few questions and he will be joining us shortly. While we get there, let's recap for you right now, because senior officials in the Home Affairs Department are getting to work, we believe almost immediately, writing this new set of directions on what should be considered when deciding on a visa for a non-citizen criminal. This comes after revelations many serious criminals had visas restored at the Administrative Appeals Tribunal because an Andrew Giles directive had allowed the tribunal to give consideration to factors like their long ties to Australia. Anthony Albanese has declared the problematic direction written in January last year, it's called Direction 99, is about to be rewritten.
And the only effective way of ensuring that tribunal members are making better decisions is to issue a new revised direction, which the Minister will be doing. The new directive will ensure that the protection of the committee outweighs any other considerations.
On my left will cease.
I will be updating Ministerial Direction 99, as the Prime Minister has just said.
Order.
The new direction will ensure that all members of the ART will adopt a common-sense approach to visa decisions, consistent with the intent of Ministerial Direction 99. First and foremost, this means ensuring that the protection of the community outweighs other considerations. This has always been the Albanese government's highest priority. Consistent with this, Speaker, and I hope members opposite would be interested in this, the revised direction will also strengthen the principles of community safety in the making of decisions, including the impact of decisions on the victim of crime and their family members, and also strengthen the family violence provisions to reflect the government's and Australians more broadly commitment to end violence against women and children.
Yes, so there was his own explanation given in the House, and only very recently did Immigration Minister Andrew Giles leave that chamber to make his way back to his Parliament House ministerial office. I'm pleased to say Andrew Giles joins us now. Welcome to the program, Andrew. Another torrid week for you, I think it's fair to say, in changing the directive you issued. Aren't you now admitting that your original Direction 99 was flawed and that the community was, in fact, endangered by it?
Good to be with you, Greg. What we've seen in the AAT decisions is that the original intent of Ministerial Direction 99 was not being followed. We've seen that. We're not seeing the common sense approach that Australians should expect, nor are we seeing the focus on community safety. And as was made clear in question time today, This was clearly a problem under previous directions under the former government too, with many examples illustrated there. So we are focused on a new revised direction that will put a high weight on community safety, but also deal specifically with some additional concerns that we see around victims and their families being heard, and of course around redoubling our focus on family violence prevention.
And there have been a number of victims and their families hurt. Do you concede the community is less safe, or at least elements of it are less safe because of the application of Direction 99, even if not your precise wording of it?
Well, some of the AAT decisions are very hard to reconcile with any sense of the expectations of the Australian community, nor, frankly, common sense. These are very concerning. That's why I've also rushed to consider cancellation submissions in respect of some of the cases that have been brought to light, and I've already cancelled 6 visas having done so. All
right. The Prime Minister said today, and we played it just a moment ago, the only effective way of ensuring tribunal members are making better decisions is to issue this revised direction. That's a clear statement, isn't it, that the directive you wrote trumps all. That is, the tribunal could only work within the bounds that you had set them, that you in fact had directed.
Well, the direction is obviously important. That's why we are making this change with the new revised direction. But as the Prime Minister also made clear in question time, there were very many issues that clearly related to the application of the former directions issued under ministers in the former government, including, of course, Peter Dutton when he was the minister responsible.
All right. Well, exactly when did you instruct officials that a new directive needs to be written? When did you decide also?
Well, I sought urgent advice, obviously, when these matters came to light late last week. And I have met with my senior officials today to go through the approach that I've outlined in the House.
Can you say that when rewritten, there will be zero possibility of any tribunal member granting or restoring a visa that you have cancelled?
What I can say is that the direction, the new revised direction, will make it abundantly clear that community safety is a consideration that outweighs all other considerations. And beyond that, as I've said earlier, we will introduce further mechanisms to enable the perspective of victims and their families to be more clearly brought to bear, and also to deal more effectively with the scourge that is family violence. Making sure that that is effective is obviously something that I'm approaching with a laser-like focus.
It doesn't sound like you're completely closing all potential loopholes, though, does it, in that explanation?
Well, I'm focused in the first instance of ensuring that a person who does not meet the requirements of the character test and is in Australia has their visa cancelled. That's something that I've been focused on doing as Minister. In terms of the decisions of the tribunal, and Greg, as you'd be well aware, yesterday we abolished the AAT and are putting in place a new, truly independent administrative review tribunal. That is an independent body. We have to give it the clearest possible guidance to ensure that its members' decisions meet the expectations of the Australian community.
All right, let's talk about how we got here, because helpfully, at least for your predicament, your department has stated in estimates today that it didn't provide information to you on the number of cases where visas were being restored. Do you say that you were let down by them?
Well, I'm deeply concerned that these cases of very serious offenders having their visas granted back to them by the AAT were not brought to my attention, and the fact is that some of these cases had been decided some time ago. That is unacceptable. My focus is now on ensuring that I can consider the cancellation of any of these cases straight away, because my focus is on community safety. But obviously we need to have the protocol that I put in place more than a year ago around, as Minister, being alerted to any such decisions, for that to be in place. And I have instructed my department to advise me me and my office within 24 hours now of any such decision of the AAT.
There is ministerial accountability, and I promise we'll get to that in a moment, Andrew Giles, but since we're talking about your own department, is that the end of it? Do you seek accountability down the line for those who failed to collate the information or failed to convey it to you? Will heads roll?
We need to look at how this happened. But at the moment, my focus, my resolute focus, is on ensuring that we are doing everything we can to ensure that the community is kept safe.
Do you accept that there is a resourcing problem, as was claimed by Home Affairs Secretary Stephanie Foster today, among the personnel who are responsible for doing the things that weren't done?
Ms Foster gave some very clear evidence around that and dealt very directly with the issue of the failure to keep me and my office advised about these things. Obviously, I will look at anything that goes to resourcing here, as I'm also focused, of course, on ensuring that consideration can be given to cancellation of any of these visas.
Well, has that advice on resourcing come to you? I would imagine that if the Secretary was saying this in public at estimates today, she may have said similar things to you. Has she? Has she requested additional resourcing?
Well, at the moment, I believe the Secretary is still in the estimates hearing. I'll be meeting with her very shortly after that finished, and I'll be discussing this issue with her.
All right. Looking back, Andrew Giles, the changes you made to Direction 99 were made at the behest of the New Zealand government, and just so happened to be Prime Minister Christopher Hipkins at the time in his talks with Prime Minister Albanese in late 2022. Doesn't your rewrite of it, announced today, amount to a reneging of the undertaking that Prime Minister Albanese gave about contemplating considerations like long ties to Australia? That's being scrapped. New Zealand's back to square one, isn't it?
Look, I don't agree with your characterisation, Greg. We make all of our decisions in Australia's national interest, and what we are seeing here is something that has not been producing the common sense and community safety focused results that the Australian government and indeed the Australian community expects. That's my focus. That's what I'm intending to pursue. Was
it a mistake to begin with?
Well, it has not produced in the AAT decisions the outcomes that we expected. It has not produced the intended or indeed the matters that we were advised would flow from the direction. That's why we are pursuing a new revised direction.
Has the government briefed the New Zealand government or even the New Zealand High Commission here in Canberra on this change?
As I understand it, those discussions are underway.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, it's not only been a tough week for you, you've actually dealt with unintended consequences ever since the NZYQ High Court decision, and then especially the emergency laws rushed through the Parliament at the final sitting days last year. They gave you powers for preventative detention orders to be sought in the courts, but it became apparent with the Nanette Simons attack in her own home in Perth that none had been sought. Do you have any update, Andrew Giles, on applications lodged for community safety orders? Have any been?
Thanks, Greg. I can tell you and your viewers that 6 cases have been referred for expert review. And then that will, and that's the stage before they can go to the court for the court to make any decision. I can also say that 26 cases, a further 26, in an advanced stage of preparation. This is a process that is extremely resource intensive. The former government's high-risk terror offender scheme, upon which this was modelled, it took 3 years for the first matter to proceed. So we are moving much more quickly because this is an absolute focus for me and for my department. Putting together one of these cases for expert review requires the consideration of thousands and sometimes tens of thousands of pages of documents and engaging with many state as well as Commonwealth authorities. So I'm very pleased to see this progress already underway.
Okay, so give us a timeline there on the first caseload, the 6 that are going to expert review. What typically could be expected? What can typically be expected in their assessment and then their onward lodgement within the court? What's the timeline for that?
Well, the 6 are with the experts at the moment, and obviously we hope to get advice from those experts, generally psychiatrists, as soon as possible to progress these matters at the earliest possible time, but also making sure, of course, as we are required, that these are high-quality applications. Rushed applications won't keep anyone safe. We recognise, too, that there is a high threshold to be met here because, of course, that is the very essence of preventative detention. Okay,
and because we're in uncharted waters here on community safety orders, what's the nature of the psychiatric advice that is sought in this review?
Well, again, the experts are there to provide advice around the propensity for reoffending and around community safety risk.
Okay, and once it reaches the High Court, the Federal Court, I should say, how long would that normally take? Would you expect, or have you received advice, for orders to be granted?
Well, this will depend, and we have obviously looked at the experience of the high-risk terror offender scheme. These are matters that are subject to the court once they get there, so it is not possible to speculate on timelines in advance or indeed on anything that might go to any individual case at risk of prejudicing that matter.
All right. Andrew Giles, I did promise finally some political accountability questions, so let's go there. You'd be well aware that your colleagues in the government have hedged when asked publicly and privately this week about your tenure in the job. Did you at any time consider whether it was honourable for you to remain as minister in light of the horrendous statistics on visa decisions involving criminal non-citizens this week?
No, my focus has been and will continue to be focusing on fixing the mess that was left by Peter Dutton. Mess that's been revealed in 3 damning reviews: Nixon, Parkinson and Richardson. And as we've seen, particularly today in media reports in the Sydney Morning Herald and in Parliament today, we have seen so many examples of decisions made by delegates of Mr Dutton when he was minister to release people in these circumstances. Decisions not by a court, as has been the case with NZYQ, not by a tribunal, decisions made by delegates of the minister. Right. This is something that is absolutely shocking, and of course Mr Dutton was also involved in the release of one of the alleged offenders at the incident involving Mr Simons in Perth. He is yet to account for his actions there some weeks on. No, thank you for making that point, and we will take it up with coalition colleagues of his. Do you feel that you owe your colleagues or anyone, including families and victims, an apology? Would you make one now? I owe the Australian community to work day and night to keep the community safe, to do everything I can do with strong laws and resources, including more than $250 million invested in supporting the cohort required to be released by the High Court in NZYQ. On these issues, I owe the Australian community, I owe my colleagues, my absolute focus on continuing doing my job, which of course involves fixing the mess we were left by Mr Dutton. All right. Andrew Giles, as we said at the outset, it's been a torrid week for you. We do appreciate you fronting for our questions today on what's been a pretty hectic afternoon, as I understand it. Thanks so much. Good to be with you, Greg. Cheers. All right, yes, so a bit to pick over there. We might do that later in the program, a somewhat longer interview than we would normally conduct, but there were lots of reasons, I think, to step through slowly with Andrew Giles, that torrid week that he had experienced. We'll come back to some of those themes with our political panel and other guests later this hour.
Now, we've attempted to cover the fact that it's Reconciliation Week this week, even though it seems less visible to most this year. We did that with Ken Wyatt on Monday. We took up some reflections on his setbacks to reconciliation that he had made with the incumbent Minister for Indigenous Australians today. Linda Burney spoke to us from her office here in Parliament House. Linda Burney, you know we always appreciate you having on the program, so welcome back once again. You've spoken in Parliament, of course, about this being Reconciliation Week. I can't help observing, though, that compared to last year, generally through the community, Reconciliation Week awareness and activity levels don't seem to be running as high as they did this time last year before The Voice. Do you acknowledge that it, like other Indigenous programs, has hit a flat spot since last year?
I understand that people have mixed feelings about reconciliation at the moment. I also acknowledge that people are still very much feeling the outcomes of the referendum. Reconciliation to me is not a destination, it's a journey. And Reconciliation Week is so important to remind people of the importance of reconciliation, of the importance of truth-telling, of the importance of working together. I've been to a number of reconciliation events this week. I was at the Kuta Girls gathering in Sydney on National Sorry Day last Sunday, and the generosity of those people that were actually victims of the stolen generation and their commitment to reconciliation and working together and understanding each other is astounding. I also went to, didn't stay for the game,
sure,
but went to Michael Long's long walk where there were thousands of Australians gathered in the spirit of reconciliation. And then last night here at the Parliament, we had the illumination of Parliament, and there were so many members of Parliament and the broader community here to see Parliament House lit up in an Aboriginal artist's design.
I'm sure it still attracts lots of support, and certainly at the events that you attend. We spoke to your former colleague and predecessor on the program this week, Ken Wyatt, who I think it's fair to say came across quite deflated about the lingering effects after the Voice vote. Stagnation, he called it, but he was also pessimistic about initiatives, new ideas, new policies on closing the gap between now and the next election. He was pretty frank about it. What he said is those who oppose the Voice are unlikely to support governments pandering, his words, to a small minority.
Look, I am good friends with Ken. I respect him deeply, but on this one, I respectfully disagree. The efforts, the investments that my government has made in terms of closing the gap in the last budget and the budget before are unprecedented. $4 billion into housing in the Northern Territory, $40 million in Central Australia for learning on country in the education arena, doubling the number of Indigenous rangers to 3,800, investments in renal dialysis machines, investments in a justice reinvestment, 3,000 new real jobs in remote Australia. That's where my focus is, and that's what we are delivering as we speak.
And will that policy area be replenished and reinvigorated between now and the next election?
The commitments that we've made are unprecedented. Just think about it. $4 billion in partnership with the Northern Territory Government to halve overcrowding in the next decade. That changes lives. It means people can be healthy. It means children can learn. It means there are adequate facilities for cooking in homes. It means there is a lot safer, there is much more safety for young people. And the other thing that we are doing is investing in clean water. I think you and I have spoken about just how so many communities don't have clean water. We are investing to give communities clean water and plentiful water. In fact, I was in Maningrida just 2 weeks ago and saw the literal work of proper water supply into that community.
These are very important practical initiatives. I don't question that for a moment. But now that the dust has settled, 7 months has passed since the vote, what about very important things that are symbolic, including constitutional recognition? Have you yet turned your mind to when the country should return to some of those questions?
The states and territories, every single one of them, have various treaty and truth-telling processes underway. And in fact, I spoke with my ministerial colleagues in the states and territories this morning to hear some of the things that's happening at that level. But the issue is this: unless we close the gap, unless we get some sort of equity in terms of life outcomes for First Nations people in this country, we are going to be going around and around and around. Yes, constitutional recognition is important, and the Albanese government fulfilled its promise in terms of holding the referendum. It wasn't the outcome that we all hoped for, but what I am on about, Greg, is that there were some really fabulous silver linings out of that defeat. 6.5 million Australians said yes. A new Aboriginal leadership is emerging with young people, and in communities like Tiwi and Wadday and Maningrida, where the population is mostly Aboriginal, the votes were around 80 to 90% plus. So these are things that I take out of it. I also say this very clearly, is that the referendum was not a full stop. It was a comma. And what I hear from people as I travel around this country is that we have to find a new way forward, and a new way forward we will. You know, reconciliation is a long journey. It's a twisty road. Progress is never easy, but progress is happening, and we just have to stay with it.
It's going to be geographically varied, though, isn't it, when you look at the fact that this is not in large measure being driven now by a national government, but by the states, as you acknowledge, and some are decidedly less active than others. Western Australia would be a very good example. Is that satisfactory?
I think states and territories are at different levels, and I'm not going to prejudge any of them. I've got a good working relationship with all states and territories, including Roger Jennet in Tasmania. And that's really important, that we've got good lines of communication. We meet regularly, and importantly, we meet regularly with the Coalition of Peace, which of course helps us drive the Closing the Gap agenda. I am full speed ahead, I can assure you, on making sure that equity is in front of this country. And the really good thing about the referendum, for whatever the outcome is, it put Aboriginal disadvantage front and centre, and every Australian understands it now, absolutely.
That is true, and your former colleague Pat Dodson spoke about the 60-40 problem that Australia's going to have to resolve. One question that's arisen and has been discussed nationally these last few days is whether Australia is or is not a racist country, does or does not have a problem with race. What's your view on that? I don't think
Australia is a racist country. But does racism exist? Of course it does. I mean, we can point to years ago now, but the Cronulla riots, for example, we can point to the experience of Adam Goods. We can point to many instances of racism. So racism does exist, but to say that Australia's a racist country, in my view, is not accurate. The point about racism is it's completely unacceptable. It doesn't matter where it happens, whether it's on the football field, whether it's in journalism, whether it's in schoolyards. It is not acceptable. And what really fills my heart is that we are hearing more and more, for example, the AFL, the NRL, where racism is not acceptable and will not be tolerated, and people are acting on it.
Yeah, I definitely sense your optimism, as always, Linda Burney, in Reconciliation Week. One last question, because we're asking it of everyone in the Albanese government right now. You are a cabinet minister. In difficult days, I think it's fair to say, for Andrew Giles as immigration minister, should he quit?
I know Andrew very well. He is a good minister. He's diligent, he's compassionate, and he's engaged. He has been delivered a decision by the High Court. He's been delivered decisions by the AAT. But I can assure you that he has my admiration, he has my respect, and he is a good minister.
We'll keep an eye on him and on the rest of the government and look forward to a discussion, who knows, maybe about Reconciliation Week this time next year. Linda Burney, always appreciated.
Thank you, Greg.
Yeah, and obviously that discussion was held a little earlier this afternoon. In fact, before question time, we've since spoken to Andrew Giles himself, and it doesn't appear that he's going anywhere if he has a say in it. Why don't we welcome in now today's political panel, and joining us right here in the studio live, Labor MP Kate Thwaites. Welcome back, Kate, and fellow Victorian or Melburnian Liberal MP Keith Wallahan. Welcome to you too, Keith. Kate, we'll start with you. Direction 99, is going to be changed. Is that the end of Andrew Giles' predicament?
Greg, I think what we see here is the Minister has been very clear that the decisions the AAT has made are out of line with what the community would expect, and indeed what the government would expect, and what the government argued in many of those cases. He has been clear that he's going to issue a new direction. More broadly, of course, the government's been doing the work of fixing up some of this mess that we were left by the previous government. That includes reforming the AAT, making sure that it is fit for purpose, making sure that we do put community safety at the centre of all of this, and that is absolutely what is happening. The
direction was flawed in the first case, wasn't it, in January of last year when it was rewritten? That is tacit, isn't it, to today's announcement?
Correct. These have been decisions of the independent tribunal. There have been directions, as I understand it, for a number of years, including under previous governments, that have gone to things that should be taken into account. Community safety is always something that should be taken into account, and that has been in all of those directions. Right. Now, the Minister has said he will issue a new direction to make that absolutely clear. And as I said, more broadly, we're doing the work to fix the AAT and to fix the mess that, frankly, we inherited from Peter Dutton. All right,
Keith Wallahan, problem sorted. You rewrite the direction that was causing headaches at the AAT, soon to be ART. Is that the end of it?
Oh, I would like for it to be the end of it, but we've seen this play out time and time again. NZYQ has created a problem that the Minister is responsible for solving. And that's the problem here. The Minister is not being responsible, whether it's in question time or answering questions about what he's actually doing to be proactive. When you look at the detail of that Direction 99, it did exactly what it was supposed to do. I think the only issue here is that the government was caught about it and they regret it. So backtracking like they have is an admission of failure, an admission that that direction that he signed, which is 24 pages and signed January last year, should never have been signed, and at the very least should have had constant monitoring, which clearly didn't happen.
Yes, there have been significant failings around that, you would acknowledge, wouldn't you, Kate? Whether it be for resourcing reasons or just incompetence, The department hasn't been providing the statistics on decisions where the AAT have overturned visa cancellations. How's that going to be fixed?
Well, I think the department has said that exactly what you just said, Greg. They haven't done their job in the way they should have. The minister's been clear the department hasn't done their job in the way that would be expected of them. So it is now obviously on the department to do their job to make sure that the minister is informed. This is important. It is important that we put community safety at the centre of all of that. That is what the government is getting on with doing. And again, I make the point, so much of this is fixing up a system that we inherited where we see time and time again these decisions that were made by Peter Dutton, a system, put in place by Peter Dutton, and we are inheriting, trying to deal with a lot of that.
The system broadly, but Direction 99, as it was rewritten in January of 2023, was to accommodate concerns put over many years by New Zealand governments that we were allegedly, to use the phrase, dumping Kiwi criminals back home who had little or no association with that country. So was it a mistake to accommodate their concerns?
Direction 99 very clearly included that community safety needed to be part of any decision. Again, as the Minister, as the Prime Minister has said, it does not seem like the AAT has reflected that in its decisions. Those decisions are out of line with community standards. We're doing the work to make sure that the independent tribunal understands those standards, understands what the government expects of it.
All right, last one to you on immigration, Keith. We did have the Minister tell us on this program, and your side's been baying for this for some time, that there is progress afoot on the seeking of community safety orders, or if you like, preventative detention orders around the NZYQ caseload. This is what Parliament rushed through in December of last year. Does that give you encouragement that that is clicking into gear?
I think the opposition, and through us and the Parliament Australians, don't have any confidence that this minister's over his brief. The change, for example, on Direction 99, the government would have us believe that it served no purpose. They changed particular words that changed the consideration of the connection to Australia from a discretion may to a mandatory consideration must will. Those words were very deliberately chosen and for a purpose. And they would have Australians believe that that was just done either accidentally or incompetently or for some other reason. But whether it's monitoring those who are subject to particular orders or have other control measures, there is no confidence that this minister is doing the work required. And again, we're seeing an issue after issue arise. And I think there's only one solution for the Prime Minister here.
All right, well, we put that question to Andrew Giles. He's obviously not going to go of his own volition. There's no indication of that. Let's move on to more sad developments in the Israel-Gaza war, Kate. There was a vote in the House earlier today on what was a Greens motion to move towards recognition of a Palestinian state. This is an aspiration of your party. Why did you vote against it?
Well, Greg, what actually happened in the House this morning was Greens moved a procedural motion
Sure.
to suspend the Parliament. Well, it is important to be clear about this because I think what we see, to be honest, time and time again from the Greens on these types of really important issues is them pulling stunts in the Parliament. So the government does not support procedural motions that interrupt the proceedings of the day, and we did not do that today. More substantially, when it comes to creating peace, getting the ceasefire that we absolutely need and the protection of civilians, the government continues to work towards that with everything we have possible, and we will be focused on that, not on stunts. On the
I understand, and thank you for clarifying. What was a procedural motion? The substance behind it would have taken us to a vote if it had got there on recognition. What are the circumstances for a Labor government in which that would be an appropriate time to recognise a Palestinian state?
Well, as the Foreign Minister has said a number of times, Australia wants to see an immediate ceasefire. We do want to see civilians protected. Greg, it is horrific what is occurring at the moment, absolutely horrific. And of course we acknowledge for a ceasefire to occur, Hamas must release the existing hostages. That is an immediate priority. In terms of then an enduring peace, a two-state solution needs to be part of that, and that is something Australia has been working on with the international community through the United Nations. And again, the Foreign Minister has said that as part of that process, there may be the need to also recognise a Palestinian state.
Yes, before a peace negotiation was actually begun, seems to be the distinction. I won't ask you about recognition, Keith, because I think we understand where your side sits. But on the question of immediate ceasefire, is the coalition at risk of being left behind by events here? Because there is a growing clamour among countries around the world that enough is enough and a ceasefire might now be nigh on due. Are you prepared to modify your position as other countries have?
I think perspective needs to be added here, and it's related to the answer to the question you've just put and the one that Kate answered. And that is that the Greens are using the Parliament as a platform for stunts, and they take a picture of who sat where, and the purpose is to put it on DLs, mostly against Labor members in their seats. And that's not the purpose of the Parliament. And Kate was right to note that the difference between a procedural motion and a substantive one. But I listened to the speech by the Greens leader, and he would have Australians believe that there's a bipartisan commitment to not only tacitly support genocide, but openly enable it. And if that's true, what kind of monsters does he think have the Liberal and Labor parties have become? It's a nonsense. And more than a nonsense, it's really dangerous. It's really dangerous. Social cohesion isn't just about us all getting along. We can disagree, and there's differences in how we should approach that issue. But we've got to be very careful about language that paints us as some sort of cartoon villains. You know, I've got a thick skin, but some people take that to a particular area that's highly dangerous for this country, and the Greens are being highly irresponsible.
I understand that. Would you assert that they were anti-Semitic in their endeavours in the House today?
I mean, on one measure, yes, they were. I mean, you can comment on the way the war is being prosecuted in a way that's not anti-Semitic. Of course you can. We wouldn't have free speech if you couldn't do that. But time and time again, we have seen that line crossed where it's going into not just hate speech, but incitement to violence, whether it's on university campuses or in many other areas. And to the credit of the Labor Party, I think they have tried to do their best in this area, but the Greens haven't. The Greens see a political advantage here, and it is highly irresponsible. And I think they need to be called out on it. And one way Labor can call them out is not to preference them in the coming election. All
right, well, we've spoken to the Greens before about it, and we always appreciate civil discussion on these matters in our program. So, Keith, Kate, well, thank you both, and let you get back to the House, where I think you might be called to vote very shortly on some other matter. Thanks so much. All right, heading overseas now. It's slow going on the planning and delivery of aid to communities cut off by the major landslide in Papua New Guinea's Southern Highlands. Reliable information seems even harder to come by than basic essentials like tents and food at present. Estimates of the number of people killed vary wildly indeed. Aid agency World Vision has offices in Port Moresby. It's involved in discussions about delivery of aid. We spoke to its PNG country director, Chris Jensen, who joined us from the capital earlier today. Chris Jensen, before you and other agencies can deliver aid to Enga province, assessments are needed about how many people have lost their homes and what their needs are. Has this been done with any accuracy yet?
Yeah, so we had two staff visit along with the UN agencies and provincial and national governments in the last yesterday and before. What we've been able to ascertain is about 1,400 households, approximately 7,400 people who've been impacted. The tragedy of this event is that we really haven't got a handle on the deceased, and it's quite traumatic, obviously, for those impacted, you know, and your hearts go out to those people. But the challenge around Enga, of course, is access. It's a very remote part of this beautiful country of Papua New Guinea. But even this area, access from Wabag, like provincial centre of Enga, is also challenging. And there are reports of further instability with the land still moving. So while we want to get some heavy moving equipment in there to try and, get through these metres and metres of rock and earth, we are really concerned that we could be making things worse. So there are some really tricky issues there associated with the search and rescue.
Okay, so has World Vision actually got any staff in the area at present?
So we got an office in Mendy in Southern Highlands, and they drove up to the landslide yesterday and then came back to Mendy again. And so we've been able to get first-hand assessments on site, and that's informed our actions. From our perspective, we're really focused on children at risk. And so we're looking at food, water, shelter, medical care, just the basics, because we've noticed that, whole households have been destroyed. This is quite a staggering event because we've got a whole mountain that fell at 3 o'clock in the morning. People had no preparation. This is just an extraordinary event. So these people in Inga province in this location really have very little. So we need to try and get as much as we can there as soon as possible.
All right, so the supplies, and you mentioned them there, supplies needed, basic forms of shelter and food. Are they physically sitting in Moresby at the moment or anywhere in PNG? Or do they have to be brought in country, transported up into the highlands? Where are they?
Great question. This is some of the challenges we're facing. Definitely in terms of the access to the Upper Highlands region, it's challenged by underdevelopment for a long period of time, particularly around tribal fighting and other challenges that have existed there for quite a while. So you are correct that some of those goods and services are challenging. We have quite a lot of materials in Mount Hagen that we can access. There has been great offers of support from governments in the region, including the Australian government, which will include logistical support. We can get things into Wabag through the airport there. So we're hoping that will be a way in which we could get some of those goods in really quickly. But yes, very, very challenging circumstances. And from my perspective, I'm really making sure that my staff are safe. So I can't proceed without making a good security assessment as well. It's a challenging, complex sort of environment to work in.
It certainly is. There is a lot to weigh up. Now, you mentioned there, Chris, that there are fears of further landslips in the area. How much is that likely to delay your response?
Yeah, look, I think it will have a concern. It will slow things down. We've been able to get engineers from the PNG Defence Force. They're coming up from Ingham Barracks in Lae in the next little while. So they should be there very shortly. And that's part of the assessment, not only of the earth itself and the rocks that are moving, but also what's caused this landslide to happen in the first place. There's a concern that the mountain itself still might be cause some landslides. We've had a lot of heavy rain recently, and so there's a thought that that's the trigger for this landslide. However, just 2 years back, we had a really massive earthquake in Southern Highlands where it also triggered a very large landslide. So at this stage, there's no reports of earthquakes, but it is a really kind of steep topography. It's remote, stunningly beautiful place. This part of Papua New Guinea has been underserved, underdeveloped for quite a long time. Many, many challenges associated with, as I've mentioned, tribal fighting and other challenges that we're working to address. But we see a huge opportunity with this development process now to take advantage of the interest and resources that are coming in to say how can we actually sort of help the people who've been impacted, by this tragic event, but actually to build back better, to look at, what are the health needs, what are the education needs, what are the development needs. The other thing to note too is that it's very close to the Porgera mine. So this is a huge amount of jobs and livelihoods that local people will be able to access and benefit from as well. The moment the highway's cut off, which is further challenging movement of people in terms of goods and services and livelihoods opportunities. So we're hoping that we can get into this and help to resolve that and help the people as soon as possible.
All right, now what about back in Moresby where you are, where the national government of PNG is experiencing some parliamentary turbulence at the moment? Is that hindering the planning and logistics for relief work that you're involved with?
Yeah, look, my view is it is not. I think that we let the political process play out as it should. And so that vote of no confidence started in the Parliament yesterday, and that will lead to a final vote next week. And that process happens as it happens, and that's not as much of a concern for us. We meet with the disaster management team that's led by the UN agencies, by some really effective leaders in the national government, public service, as well as provincial government, and I've seen the work that they've been doing in the collaborative efforts, and it really hasn't been hampered or hasn't been a part of our discussions. It is really challenging in terms of the disaster response. Only last week we were discussing in our office how we respond to flooding in Western Province. We've also got flooding and earthquakes that happened in East Sepik. We've just recently responded to volcanoes in Bougainville, and then there was East New Britain. We had Mount Uluwan volcano as well. So there are some challenges around natural disasters here in PNG, but my point is that we're pretty good at responding to natural disasters here, and we're pretty good at responding and doing what we need to do to help the people. But yeah, resources are stretched at the moment, but this is where it's fantastic to know that the Australian government has stepped up, as they often do, New Zealand government as well. There's lots of other governments as well that have put forward their contributions to help the PNG people at this time. So we really appreciate that.
Well, exactly. It mightn't come as much comfort to those without homes in the Highlands right now, but it's true. PNG's troubles have captured the attention of nations in the region in good and helpful ways. Chris Jensen, thanks for the update.
Thank you very much.
Well, American presidential electioneering's cranking up, and the US Study Centre has today launched a Ready Reckoner on it. We spoke to its researcher, Jared Monshine, about this. Jared Monshine, welcome to our studio. Now, in your lengthy publication from the US Study Centre, you've attempted to answer questions that to many of us seem quite unanswerable at the moment. What would a second Trump or a second Biden presidency mean for Australia? Let's start with a big focus on the Indo-Pacific and China. Your report talks about the dual approaches to Beijing in the US, cooperation and competition. Do you really expect Donald Trump to cooperate with Beijing?
Yeah, I don't know if it's cooperation as much as engagement. I think the U.S., regardless of who wins the election, no president wants a war with China. And so both Biden and Trump really prioritize one-on-one bilateral meetings with Xi Jinping. And I think that's going to continue no matter what. And they're going to continue to have these big meetings between the U.S. and Chinese presidents, regardless of whether it's Biden or Trump. But at the same time, both presidents would also want competition. And I think here's where we might find a difference. As much as there is bipartisan consensus in the U.S. about strategic competition, and this is Democrats and Republicans agree that they want to compete with China, but what that actually looks like on the ground, how do you prosecute that competition? And I think Donald Trump has made clear that his focus is really on economics. And if there's anything that we know about Donald Trump is that he's changed his tune on a number of different things, but there is some consistency in his behavior. And one thing is on trade. And so his really laser-like focus on trade and economic imbalances with China is something that will probably dominate his approach to China more than the Biden administration. But it's not like the Biden administration is not focusing on trade. They're just widening the scope of what they want to deal with.
Well, indeed. They've only recently jacked up tariff walls on electric vehicles, solar panels and the like. Now, let's talk about Australia's influence under either scenario. The report notes that presidencies often mature and even mellow in a second term. If Trump wins re-election, his advisors understandably will feel validated and emboldened. Is there any reason to think that Australia's access will be, relative to other countries, more open to the White House under a Trump presidency than it was for many countries first time around?
Well, I think it's important to note that under the the Trump administration, no country in my mind did better than Australia in many ways. In terms of the way that it did not get any of the steel and aluminum tariffs that other countries did, including Japan. There's no threatening of the Australian alliance. There's no issue about Australia needing to pay up. And why is that? I think Australia's doing what America wants its allies to do. It is burden sharing in its security arrangements. It is investing in its military more than most other nations, including European nations. It is really taking on ownership of the responsibility of economic leadership in the region. And you know, some folks might even say that AUKUS is a threat under a Trump administration, but I don't really think it is. I think in many ways the structural advantages Australia has that and what AUKUS further enables makes AUKUS pretty safe in a Trump administration. He might want to tinker with it as he does with other issues, but on the whole, I think the influence of Australia, which by the way, I should note that AUKUS was an Australian idea, not an American idea, continues regardless of who's in the White House.
Yeah, I did have more specific questions on AUKUS. So since you've taken us there, Jared, we saw Scott Morrison talking to Donald Trump at Trump Towers in New York very recently. And the indications coming from that meeting were that he's not planning to interrupt AUKUS or break it down. And yet a lot of Republicans in Washington do see a binary trade-off between, you know, every nuclear-powered submarine given to Australia or sold to Australia is one less that America has to be the superpower that it wants to continue to be. Would that persist, do you think, that view under a Republican-dominated Congress and a Trump presidency?
Yeah, so there's, as I said, bipartisan consensus on China, but there's also bipartisan consensus on supporting Australia. So any objections to AUKUS is not that they don't want Australia to get the technology. It's a question of, does the U.S. have the capacity to enable submarines going from the U.S. to Australia? But there is also, in my view, a relatively simple solution, and that is the U.S. investing more in its defense industrial base. And recent legislation over the past 6 months in particular has done exactly that. Many billions of dollars have been legislated to allow for more production capacity of American submarines. And so I think that is really the way out of this. Outside of that, there's no objections to AUKUS and both Pillar 1 and Pillar 2.
Now, the economy, at least insofar as the climate transition elements of it, are really big investment tickets in the US and in Australia now. That's where all policy and much investment is driving presently. Obviously, you would expect a re-elected Joe Biden as president to continue to push that. What about Donald Trump, who, let's face it, in the past has pulled the US out of the UN's climate frameworks? Does he remain as deeply sceptical about some of these investments as he does about climate change in the broad?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think if you frame it as climate, I think you can say that they are polar opposites in many ways. But then if you look at one level beneath climate, what exactly, for example, in the US-Australia Climate Compacts, what does that consist of? And that is the US and Australia talking about how they're going to work on a number of different areas. But we shorthand it to Climate Compact, but it's also about energy security. It's also about critical minerals. And then if you look at the Climate Compact specifically, it's also about battery technology and hydrogen power. There's all sorts of, I think, tangible climate aspects of what we call climate issues that will also occur in the Trump administration, but will not necessarily be called climate. I think it's in the U.S. interest to do more on secure energy security, to do more on critical minerals, do more on battery technology, to do more on hydrogen opportunities for the U.S., but it just takes a different shape and has different rhetoric than a Biden administration.
It'll be marketed as jobs and investment for Americans rather than as a climate initiative.
Well, maybe I think the Biden administration would be very clear that they want to be jobs and investment in America and climate, maybe not one or the other.
Yeah, and now I know as part of your work in preparing these reports, you try to tap into the mood of Australians, and you've been in Parliament House talking to politicians. Do you have an assessment, Jared, about the level of anxiety in Australia, either out in the general population or even within the federal polity here in Canberra, about what lies ahead in November?
I think one thing that we do, in addition to engagement in Parliament, one thing we do at the US Study Centre is that we like like to bring American experts out here as well. And one thing that I tell American experts, whether it be members of Congress, whether it be thought leaders, opinion page writers, I tell them before they speak, you are going to speak to an audience that will remind you of a Washington, D.C. audience. You have to understand that level of knowledge that Australians, especially in Canberra, have about U.S. politics and U.S. issues and just broader dynamics within the U.S. And I think that has really paid dividends for Australia. And now more than ever, I think Australians understand and appreciate the broader structural issues at play in the U.S. and Australian alliance. And I think they also realize and appreciate that the alliance is more than just the leaders of the country. This is something that is bipartisan, goes across many generations, and will likely continue long into the future.
That is true. Those bonds are deep and wide. Many families, of course, have students going to universities in the US and vice versa. Look, so much to look at in this report and in the months up to and beyond the election. Jared Montshine, we might stay in touch.
Thank you.
All right, well, a busy hour here today. Thanks for being with us, especially as we stepped Andrew Giles through some troubles in his immigration portfolio. A bit of news in that one. We'll have more when we're back with you tomorrow. Have a great evening.